In a sealed jar of unfired clay, buried beneath the collapsed mud brick of a temple storeroom in what was once the city of Eridu, archaeologists in the early 1960s found 11 tablets stacked in a deliberate order, wrapped in the remains of a reed mat that had long since rotted into dust around them. 10 of the tablets were unremarkable by the standards of that dig. Ration lists, a hymn, a dispute over the ownership of a canal. The 11th was different, and it sat quite literally at the bottom of the stack, as though it had been placed there last, or protected, or hidden beneath the others on purpose. It took nearly 2 decades before anyone gave that 11th tablet serious attention, because the vocabulary it used did not match anything in the standard Sumerian lexicon compiled by generations of scholars before it. It used words for bodily fluids that appeared nowhere else in the archive. It used a verb, repeated, 4 times across its short surface that translators eventually rendered with considerable hesitation as to taste and to know. And it was addressed, in its opening line, not to a king, not to a priest, not to the general reader, a temple scribe might expect, but to Enki himself, the god the Sumerians placed at the center of their entire cosmology. Of knowledge, the one who was said to have shaped the first humans out of clay and river water, the one whose domain was not war, not harvest, not the sky, but something closer to what we would now call science. Enki was the god of understanding. And this tablet, as strange as it sounds to say out loud, appears to be a record of something Enki understood, and chose, for reasons the text itself never quite explains, to have written down. The subject of that understanding is human tears. Not tears as a symbol, not tears as a metaphor for grief, the way so much ancient poetry uses them, but tears as a substance, something Enki is described as having examined directly, the way a physician examines blood, the way a chemist examines a sample drawn from an unknown source. The tablet describes him gathering the water that falls without wound, a phrase scholars agree distinguishes emotional tears from the ordinary tears produced by dust, smoke, or injury. Tears that Sumerian medicine, like most ancient medical traditions, already understood and had separate vocabulary for. This is a distinction worth sitting with for a moment, because it means whoever wrote this text, whether it was a scribe recording an old oral tradition or something closer to a technical note passed down through a lineage of temple physicians, already understood something that modern biochemistry did not formally confirm until the 20th century, that not all tears are the same fluid. Reflex tears, the kind produced when a speck of dust lands in your eye, are almost entirely water, a simple saline rinse meant to flush an irritant away. Basal tears, the kind that keep your eyes lubricated every waking moment without you ever noticing them, are similarly plain. But emotional tears, the tears produced by grief, by overwhelming joy, by the specific ache of watching someone you love walk away, are chemically distinct. They carry hormones. They carry proteins that don't appear in the other 2 categories at anything like the same concentration. They are, in the most literal biochemical sense, a different substance entirely, produced by a different neurological pathway, triggered not by the body's need to protect the eye, but by something happening much deeper, in the limbic structures that govern emotion itself. The tablet claims Enki noticed exactly this distinction, 4,000 years before a laboratory anywhere on Earth had the tools to confirm it. And having noticed it, the text says he did what the god of knowledge in Sumerian mythology was always depicted doing when he encountered something he did not yet understand. He tested it, he compared it, and when the results confused him, he kept testing. According to the tablet, Enki first compared the tears of the newly shaped humans against those of every other creature he had made or observed in the world he shared with them. The tablet lists these comparisons in a rhythm that almost certainly served as a mnemonic device for scribes memorizing it. The tears of the lion, which flow only from wound and wind. The tears of the ox, the same. The tears of the bird, so rare as to barely exist at all. Modern biology, again, arrives independently at something remarkably close to this ancient list. The overwhelming majority of animals do not produce emotional tears in any form comparable to humans. Elephants have long been rumored to cry from grief, and there are documented cases of elephants producing excess ocular fluid during moments of extreme stress. But researchers who have studied this closely have generally attributed it to physiological stress responses rather than emotional tear production in the human sense. The fluid appears to be a side effect of stress hormones acting on the body generally, not a dedicated system for expressing feeling through the eyes specifically. Dogs, famously loyal, famously expressive in their own way, do not cry emotional tears either, whatever a mournful expression around the eyes might suggest to an owner convinced otherwise. Primates, our closest biological relatives, do not do it. Nothing in the fossil record, nothing in any species alive today that biologists have been able to study in controlled conditions, produces tears specifically and exclusively as an emotional response the way humans do. It is, as far as the entire tree of life is concerned, a genuinely unique trait, and scientists still do not fully agree on why it evolved or what evolutionary advantage it could possibly confer on a species to visibly, uncontrollably signal distress to everyone around it, including predators and rivals who might exploit that vulnerability. This is where the tablet becomes genuinely strange, because it does not stop at noting the uniqueness of the trait. It goes further into territory that no comparative zoology, ancient or modern, would normally think to explore. The text says that when Enki tasted the water, and the verb here really does appear to mean taste, not simply examine, the detailed translators have puzzled over for years, since tasting a fellow being's tears is not an act any surviving Sumerian ritual or medical text describes anywhere else. He found something in it that he could not identify. The tablet's word for this substance has no clean modern equivalent. The closest translation available renders it as the salt that remembers, a phrase that sounds purely poetic until you set it beside a body of contemporary research that most people, even those fascinated by ancient mysteries, have never heard of: the study of what scientists now call chemosignaling in human tears. In 2011, a team of researchers published findings showing that when men were exposed to the scent of women's emotional tears, not sad stories, not sad images, but the actual physical tears themselves, collected under laboratory conditions, measurable changes occurred in their testosterone levels and in brain activity associated with sexual arousal, despite the subjects reporting no conscious awareness of smelling anything at all. The tears, in other words, appeared to be carrying a chemical signal, invisible, odorless to conscious perception, that altered the physiology of another human being simply by proximity. Follow-up research has continued to explore this possibility, some of it suggesting that emotional tears may carry chemical signals capable of suppressing aggression in people who encounter them, essentially functioning as a kind of built-in peace signal, a molecular message that says, without words, without even conscious awareness on either end, something has happened here that requires a different kind of response than conflict. If this research holds up under further study, and the scientific community remains genuinely divided on how strong and how universal this effect actually is, it would mean human tears are not simply a visual signal, the reddened eyes and wet cheeks that alert others to distress. They would be a chemical one too, a message sent and received entirely outside conscious awareness, passed from one nervous system to another through nothing more than the shared air between two people standing close enough to breathe it. The tablet, written by people who had no access to gas chromatography, no access to hormone assays, no access to any of the instruments that let modern researchers detect these signals at all, nonetheless describes something that sounds remarkably like an early mythologized version of exactly this idea. Enki, the text says, found in human tears a quality that passed between people without the mouth speaking and without the ear listening, a description that, translated into the language of modern neuroscience, is not far at all from a chemical signal bypassing conscious language entirely and acting directly on another person's physiology. Whether this represents genuine ancient insight passed down through careful, patient observation over countless generations, the kind of insight illiterate oral traditions were often remarkably good at preserving, even without understanding the underlying mechanism, or whether it represents nothing more than a compelling coincidence, a poetic phrase that happens by chance to resemble a modern scientific finding. It could not possibly have anticipated is a question no single tablet can settle on its own. But the tablet does not stop there either, and this is the part of the story that has kept researchers arguing about it long after the initial excitement of the discovery faded. The text claims that Enki, having found this unidentifiable quality in human tears, attempted to explain it to the other gods present in the assembly, a common narrative device in Sumerian myth, where major discoveries and disputes are often staged as debates among the gathered deities. And according to the tablet, the other gods dismissed him. They told him, in language the text renders with unusual bluntness for a genre normally full of formal, respectful address, even in moments of conflict, that he was mistaking water for meaning, that grief was simply grief, that he had spent too long shaping creatures out of river clay, and had begun imagining depths in them that were never actually placed there. Enki, the tablet says, did not argue further. He simply recorded what he had found, sealed the record, and, in a line that has become the centerpiece of every modern retelling of this story, said that the humans themselves would eventually find it on their own, not through the god's mouth, but through their own instruments in a time when clay no longer needed a stylus to speak. It is difficult to read that final phrase without feeling a small chill, whatever your position on the historical reliability of the tablet as a whole. A time when clay no longer needs a stylus to speak is, at minimum, an evocative way to describe a future defined by writing that does not require carving into wet earth, printed pages perhaps, or something further still. Skeptics point out reasonably that ancient prophetic language is almost always vague enough to be read as prescient after the fact, and that reading modern technology into a 4,000-year-old turn of phrase says more about our own desire to find ourselves prefigured in the past than it does about any genuine ancient foresight. This is a fair and important caution, and it should sit alongside every other claim in this account, not as a dismissal of the mystery, but as the necessary discipline that keeps a genuine mystery from collapsing into wishful thinking. Still, the core claim of the tablet, that there is something detectable, something real, something present in human tears that Enki is described as finding in no other creature he examined, deserves to be taken seriously on its own terms, separate from the question of prophecy or divine foresight. Because whatever you make of the mythological framing, the underlying biological claim happens to be true, verified independently, centuries after this tablet was carved, by researchers who had never heard of it and were not looking for it. Human emotional tears really are chemically unique. They really do appear to carry information beyond simple hydration and irritant flushing. And humans really do appear to be, as far as the evidence currently allows us to say, alone among all known species in producing them specifically as an expression of feeling rather than injury. It is worth pausing to say more about how a text like this even survives to reach us at all, because the survival itself is part of what makes the story compelling. The tablet was written in a dialect of Sumerian that had already begun to fall out of common use by the time it was likely composed, sometime in the latter half of the 3rd millennium BCE, during a period when Akkadian was steadily displacing Sumerian as the everyday spoken language of Mesopotamia, even as Sumerian persisted, much like Latin persisted in medieval Europe, as the language of scholarship, religion, and archived knowledge. Scribes of that later period were often copying texts they themselves could only partially read, preserving grammar and vocabulary through careful, almost ritualistic transcription. The same way a monk in a medieval scriptorium might copy a Greek manuscript without fully grasping every nuance of the language beneath his pen. This matters here because it means the tablet found at Eridu is very likely not the original composition at all, but a copy of a copy, possibly several generations removed from whatever oral or written tradition first gave rise to it. Small details could have shifted with each transcription. Words could have been misread, reinterpreted, softened, or sharpened by scribes working centuries after the knowledge first took shape. This is not a flaw unique to this tablet. It is true of nearly everything that survives from the ancient Near East, and scholars account for it constantly when weighing how much confidence to place in any single reading. But it is a caution worth repeating before placing too much weight on any single phrase, however striking that phrase might sound when read aloud in a darkened room 4,000 years later. The scholarly reception of this tablet, in the small circles where it has actually been discussed, has been sharply divided, and it would be misleading to suggest otherwise. A number of specialists in Sumerian religious literature have argued that the entire tears narrative is best understood as an elaborate, poetic meditation on human vulnerability and mortality, consistent with a broader Mesopotamian literary tradition that frequently used bodily fluids, blood, milk, tears, even breath, as symbolic vehicles for exploring what separated humanity from both gods and animals. In this reading, Enki's inability to identify the substance in human tears is not a claim about biochemistry at all, ancient or otherwise, but a theological statement about the limits of even divine understanding when confronted with human suffering, a way of saying that grief carries something even a god of wisdom cannot fully explain. This is, it should be said plainly, the majority scholarly position, held by most of the handful of specialists who have examined the tablet closely, and it deserves serious weight precisely because it comes from people who have spent entire careers learning to read this literature on its own terms, rather than searching it for hidden modern science. And yet the minority position has never entirely gone away, kept alive largely by researchers working outside traditional Assyriology, comparative mythologists, a few independent linguists, and more recently, a handful of biochemists who encountered the translated tablet almost by accident, and were struck, by their own accounts, by how specifically its language seemed to anticipate distinctions in tear biology that had no obvious reason to appear in a Bronze Age religious text unless someone, somewhere in that long chain of transmission, really had been paying unusually close attention to something real. It is this minority position that keeps drawing new researchers back to the tablet every few years, not because the evidence has become any stronger, but because the coincidence, examined honestly, remains difficult to fully explain away. Ancient traditions were not, after all, incapable of careful empirical observation simply because they lacked modern instruments. Sumerian astronomers tracked planetary movements with an accuracy that still impresses modern astronomers using nothing but patient generational observation recorded meticulously over centuries. Egyptian physicians, working entirely without germ theory, developed surprisingly effective wound treatments through trial, error, and careful record-keeping passed down through medical schools attached to their temples. It is not inherently implausible that a healing tradition somewhere in ancient Mesopotamia, tending to the grieving and the sick over many generations, might have noticed patterns in how people around mourners behaved, patterns subtle enough to escape casual notice, but consistent enough, over enough repetitions, to eventually work their way into a story about a god tasting the water that falls without wound. There is also a broader mythological context worth placing this tablet inside, because Enki's association with fluids, with the substances that carry life and change from one body to another, runs through nearly everything the Sumerians wrote about him. He is the god of the Abzu, the freshwater ocean the Sumerians believed lay beneath the earth, the source of all rivers, all wells, all the water that made agriculture and therefore civilization itself possible. He is credited in multiple surviving myths with mixing his own bodily fluids with river clay to shape the first humans, breathing something of himself into the material he worked. A god whose entire mythological identity centers on fluid as the medium of creation and transformation is, in a sense, exactly the deity a Bronze Age storytelling tradition would reach for if it wanted to explore the mystery of why human tears seem to carry more weight than simple water. Whether that reflects genuine ancient insight into tear biochemistry, or simply reflects the internal logic of a mythology already deeply preoccupied with fluids as vehicles of meaning, is, once again, impossible to settle with total certainty. But the pattern is there, consistent across dozens of surviving Enki texts, and it lends at least a certain thematic coherence to this one, however strange its specific claims may sound in isolation. There's a detail from the biochemistry of tears themselves that makes this ancient claim even harder to dismiss as pure coincidence, because it points toward exactly the kind of thing the tablet describes without any modern researcher setting out to prove an ancient myth correct. Emotional tears contain elevated levels of a hormone called prolactin, associated with bonding, with lactation, with the deep physiological architecture of caregiving that runs through mammalian biology. They contain leucine and kephalin, a natural pain-relieving compound, present in tears at levels high enough that some researchers have speculated crying itself may function as a kind of built-in emotional analgesic, a chemical release valve the body reaches for automatically when the mind cannot process distress any other way. They contain adrenocorticotropic hormone, a marker of the body's stress response, present in emotional tears at levels significantly higher than in tears produced by simple irritation. In other words, when you cry from grief, or from an overwhelming rush of relief, or from watching someone you love finally come home after too long away, your body is not simply leaking water from an overfilled well of feeling. It is manufacturing a specific, targeted chemical cocktail, unlike anything it produces under any other circumstance, and releasing it, quite literally, into the open air, where it can be seen, and, as the more contested but genuinely fascinating research suggests, where it may also, in ways we are only beginning to measure, be sensed. Whether Enki, or the tradition of storytellers and scribes who eventually wrote his name onto this particular tablet, actually understood any of this in the way modern biochemistry understands, it is, in the strictest sense, unknowable. Myth has always been remarkably good at wrapping intuition in the language of gods, at preserving through story what a culture had not yet developed the instruments to prove. It is entirely possible that generations of careful, unrecorded observation, grieving parents noticing something in the way a room seemed to settle after a child's tears fell, mourners noticing how anger seemed to soften in the presence of open weeping, healers noticing patterns too subtle and too slow to name but real enough to pass down anyway, eventually crystallized into a story. And the story eventually crystallized into a text, and the text eventually found its way into a jar at the bottom of a stack of ordinary tablets in a temple storeroom in Eridu, waiting 4,000 years for someone with the right instruments and the right patience to finally take it seriously. There is one more strand of this story worth including, because it touches on a question that sits underneath everything else here, quietly, and does not go away once you start thinking about it. If emotional tears really do carry a chemical signal, one that other people register without ever consciously smelling or tasting anything, then crying is not merely an internal release, the way it is so often described in modern conversations about mental health and emotional processing. It is a form of communication, aimed outward, whether the person crying intends it or not. It suggests that grief, in some very literal biochemical sense, was never designed to be private. The body appears to want it witnessed, wants it near enough to another body that the signal can actually reach someone. This sits oddly against a great deal of modern cultural instinct, which tends to treat crying as something to do alone, something to suppress in public, something faintly embarrassing to be caught doing in front of colleagues or strangers. If the tablet's underlying observation is right, and if the modern research pointing in the same direction continues to hold up under further scrutiny, Then that modern instinct toward privacy may be working directly against something the body itself is built to do. We may be, quite literally, suppressing a signal evolution spent a very long time refining, for reasons that have far more to do with social convention than with anything resembling biological necessity. It is tempting, faced with a detail like that, to draw a tidy lesson from it. Something about the value of allowing grief to be witnessed, about the cost of a culture that treats tears as weakness rather than as communication, and there may well be something true in that lesson, whatever its ultimate source. But it is worth resisting the urge to package this story into something too neat, too resolved, because the honest state of the evidence does not actually support a tidy conclusion. What the research shows, cautiously and with real scientific disagreement still unresolved, is that human emotional tears are chemically distinct from other tears, that they may carry signals capable of influencing the physiology of people nearby, and that no other species studied so far appears to do anything quite like it. What the tablet shows, just as cautiously, is that a 4,000-year-old Sumerian religious text appears to describe something resembling this distinction, wrapped in the language of a god tasting an unidentifiable substance he could not name. Connecting those two facts too tightly risks overstating both of them. Sitting with the coincidence, without forcing it into more certainty than it can bear, is the more honest position, even if it is also the less satisfying one. What perhaps matters most in the end is not whether Enki actually existed to taste anything at all, but what the persistence of this story says about how long humans have been asking the same question about themselves, long before laboratories, before mass spectrometers, before anyone had the language to talk about hormones or neural pathways. Someone looked at another person crying and sensed correctly that something more than water was passing between them. That intuition was old enough and strong enough to survive being carved into wet clay, copied by scribes who may not have fully understood it themselves, buried under a collapsed temple roof, forgotten for 4,000 years, and finally translated by people working with tools no Sumerian could have imagined. And when those tools were finally turned, quite separately, toward the actual chemistry of tears, they found something that rhymes unmistakably with what that old story had been saying all along. What remains in the end is not proof of anything supernatural, and it would be a disservice to the genuine strangeness of this story to dress it up as more than it honestly is. It is, instead, one of those rare points where an ancient text and a modern laboratory appear to be circling the same quiet fact from two entirely different directions, one through myth, one through mass spectrometry, and arriving, against every reasonable expectation, at something that looks very much like agreement. Humans cry, and in crying produce something no other creature on this planet is known to produce in quite the same way. Whether that fact was first noticed by a Bronze Age god of wisdom tasting the salt on a grieving mortal's cheek, or by a research team in a modern laboratory measuring hormone concentrations under fluorescent light, the observation itself does not change. Somewhere in that thin, salt water, in a substance so common that almost every person alive has produced it without a second thought, there is something the rest of the living world has never managed to make. And whether you find your way to that fact through careful reading of a translated tablet or through a peer-reviewed paper on chemosignaling, the question it leaves behind is the same one it has apparently been leaving behind for 4,000 years. What exactly are we saying? Every time we cry that nothing else alive has ever learned how to say.